Hello, everybody. Let me get my head space going there. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening for our next class in the book of Deuteronomy. My voice sounds a little unusual, a little unlike it usually does to this evening. It's because Catherine and I have been combating some sort of nasal congestion illness or allergy. I don't know what it is, but it's very annoying, and it changes the way my voice sounds sometimes. So we are going to be in Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 14. So if you have your Bible with you, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Last week we looked at the end of Moses' first speech in the book of Deuteronomy and how it focused on Israel not forgetting where they've come from and what purpose they have been given by God, and the fact that they are to serve the Lord God instead of all the other gods of the Canaanites or other pagan nations around them. They are not to indulge in idolatrous practices. They are to serve the one true God, and He is the one true God alone. And that is where we left off last time. Now Moses begins in chapter 12 his second speech in the book of Deuteronomy. You remember there are three big speeches that he makes. This is the beginning of the second. Moses' second speech in Deuteronomy is actually where the book gets its name. Deuteronomy comes from two Greek words meaning, that is deutero, meaning second, number two, and nomikon, which means law. And so Deuteronomy, just by its name, is the second law, or the second delivery of the law. It's, of course, called this because most of the laws in this section are repeat ones from previous books of Moses that we have seen. Now, a few of them are unique to the book of Deuteronomy, but there isn't any really theological significance to that fact. It's not like there is one set of the law and then there's this other one in Deuteronomy. It's that it is just the second sort of full expression of the law, and there's a little bit more detail given in certain parts that constitute them being new ordinances. So there's not a theological significance to that. It's the same law of Moses. It's just being given the second time and with different details and different words used. Again, when reading the laws in the Old Testament, it is beneficial to discern the underlying principles of the commandments expressed in the law, as the ordinances themselves have been, I'll use quotation marks because it's only this kind of word in our English version, abolished by Jesus in the redemptive work that He's done. And the passage in the New Testament that says that is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, where it says, "For He Himself is our peace, who has made us both one," both talking about Jews and Greeks, or Jews and Gentiles. So you know that this is talking about the law of Moses when it says here, "He has broken down in His flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that He might create in Himself one new man in place of the two, and so make peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostilities." Now, I said I put quotation marks around that word abolish that it uses there because the actual Greek word is not the word for abolish, like to outlaw, and it's also not the word for destroy. It's really the word for to wear something out, to bring it to its end, and that reflects the idea that, in Galatians chapter 3, Paul brings this up. The law of Moses had a very particular purpose, and now that the faith has arrived, now that Jesus' redemptive work is completed, the purpose of the law of Moses was fulfilled, and therefore it was not in effect anymore. It was replaced with the new covenant, which is the book of Hebrews says it's much better because it accomplishes what the law was pointing towards the whole time. It actually does it. So It's not that the law of Moses was destroyed. It's not that it was outlawed. That's what the word abolish means. But it was worn out. It was brought to its proper and intended ending. And that is what Paul means in the book of Ephesians. And that's why we don't necessarily pay attention to the discussion of, are we supposed to follow the laws and the laws of Moses? Are we supposed to adopt just some of them? Are we supposed to discern between what we should adopt and what we shouldn't adopt? That's not the discussion that's meant to be had. The discussion instead is, what do these laws and the underlying principles of them tell us about the mind and the heart and the will of God? Because while the commandments expressed in ordinances have been brought to their end, the God of all remains the God of all. And he remains the same, quote, yesterday, today, and forevermore. And if we are to be people who have the law of God written on our hearts and in our minds, then it behooves us to use this very helpful resource, the law that was written in the Old Testament, to help us learn and appreciate what God appreciates and what God hates, what he dislikes. So this first section has all to do with how Israel worships the Lord their God. So let's start reading. We're going to read verses 1 through 7 here. Deuteronomy chapter 12, if you didn't turn there already. Moses says, "These are the statutes and the rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess, all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills, and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars, and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods, and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings and your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake in which the Lord your God has blessed you." So here God points, he gives two major points in this paragraph. He says, it will not be at the pagans' holy sites or with their pillars and idols that Israel shall worship. He is talking about where Israel is supposed to worship. It will not be at the pagans' holy sites. The pagan nations usually worshipped on high places. That is, the idea is that is where heaven and earth met, and so it is like a divine hotspot. So if you were going to go and worship the gods anywhere, you would do it on the high place. Excuse me. I got the thing in my throat. You remember. So he says, you will not do it at their holy places where they worshipped. You will not do it with their pillars or with their idols. And he lists a few other things, their green trees and their Asherim. Pagans very often worshipped using trees, especially like luxuriant, beautiful trees. It's sort of the idea of the tree of life theme having been carried into different cultures and corrupted by those cultures and their idolatrous tendencies, you know. But anyway, I digress. That's just a fun detail for us to understand. So, where is Israel to worship? If they're not supposed to use these pagan holy sites, where are they to worship? And God says, it will be where the Lord has chosen to make his habitation. This, by the way, is why Jesus accepted worship, wherever he happened to be. You'll find that in John chapter 1, verse 1, and John chapter 1, verse 14. You'll find that he is God in the flesh, right? He was, John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. So Jesus accepted worship, which is really significant, because he was God in the flesh, and therefore it was proper for him to accept worship. There are other parts in the Bible where a person bows down to worship at the feet of an angel, and the angel says, don't do that. I'm not God. Worship God. I am just a fellow servant of God, just like you. Don't worship me. Worship the Lord. And that makes the fact that Jesus accepted worship just that much more significant, because God said to the Jews, you guys are going to worship wherever I make my habitation, wherever I make my dwelling place. And John 1:14 says, God made his dwelling place among us, and he was in the flesh, and so we worshipped him wherever he was. And I also find it interesting that this might show a little bit of the mind of God, the fact that where it happens doesn't really matter as much as to whom the worship happens. He says, the question is, if we're not supposed to use the pagan holy places, the high places up on those mountains where there's lots of green trees and there's, maybe some springs of water, where are we supposed to worship God? And he says, where I am. You worship me, so you worship where I happen to be. Not at the high places, not at these holy sites, but you worship me where I am. It reflects or rather Jesus reflects this when he's speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, and he says, the time is coming, and it is now here, where it's not going to matter where you worship. It's not going to matter if you do it on this high mountain or if you do it in Jerusalem, but it's going to matter how you worship. Because God is looking for people who will worship him truly and worship him in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and therefore the one who would worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so this commandment that God gives them of where they're going to worship just is simply boiling it down to, you worship me, so you worship where I am. Not at these pagan holy sites that, because of some cultural tradition, have been pegged as holy sites. You worship me where I tell you to. Then he goes on in verses 8 through 14, and I'll speed it up here. He says, where not to offer to the Lord. I know it sounds like we already just talked about this, but he goes into detail here. He says, you cannot make an offering to God just anywhere you like. It is there's a proper place for these kinds of things. It must be at the place that God has chosen for his presence to dwell. Now, where is that place in the context of the Old Covenant of the Law of Moses? That place is where the tabernacle is. It's where the Ark of God is. And so they worship there. They give their offerings there. And then he goes on. This is from verses 15 through 28. He says, however, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns as much as you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and as of the deer, Only you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it out on the earth like water. You may not eat within your towns the tithe of your grain, or of your wine, or of your oil, or the firstborn of your herds, or of your flocks, or any of your vow offerings that you vow, or your freewill offerings, or the contribution that you present. But you shall eat them before the Lord your God in the place that the Lord your God will choose. You and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite, who is within your towns, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in all that you undertake. Take care that you do not neglect the Levite as long as you live in the land. When the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you crave meat, you may eat meat wherever you want. If the place that the Lord your God will choose to put his name there is too far from you, then you may kill any of your herd or your flock which the Lord has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat within your towns whenever you desire. Just as the gazelle or the deer is eaten, so you may eat of it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. Only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it out on the earth like water. You shall not eat it, that all may go well with you and your children after you, when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. But the holy things that are due from you, your vow offerings you shall take, and you shall go to the place that the Lord will choose, and offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, on the altar of the Lord your God. The blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out on the altar of the Lord your God, but the flesh you may eat. Be careful to obey all these words that I command you, that it may go well with you and with your children after you forever, when you do what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. So, what is God saying here? He is talking about what their customs for eating are supposed to be. And there are two different meals that the Israelites would be eating. One is just a normal meal, and God says, you can eat a regular meal wherever you want. It doesn't matter. But and anyone can eat of your regular meal. But you cannot eat the blood. There's still the stipulation. We mentioned this back in the book of Leviticus, and also in the book of Numbers. The blood is for sacrificing. It's not for eating. And drinking blood was a common pagan practice back in the ancient world. And even in the modern day, there are references to it. If you ever watched, vampires are a very popular thing in movies and books. And that the idea of drinking blood, that comes from paganism, and the vampire is supposed to be like this demonic creature or whatever, and so it's brought into there. But also, this might not register with a lot of the people who are watching, but if you've ever seen the movie Red Dawn, they drink blood as a part of their family hunting trip, because sounds weird, but this is very much pulled out of ancient paganism. They drink the blood of this deer that they kill because they want to be like one with the spirit of hunting or something like that. That is, gods and goddesses of the hunt were very much common in the pagan world because that was very important to people. It's how they got their food. So it's no surprise that involves drinking the blood to be one with those spirits or gods or whatever. So drinking blood was a very common pagan practice, and a very common theme in the Bible is you do not engage in these pagan practices. That's the reason why God told them not to worship on all of these pagan holy sites, these high places. Instead, they're to do it just where God told them to. And it's the reason why a lot of the food laws exist. They're connected to pagan practices, and God wanted to have his people separated from pagan practices. So that covers the normal, regular meal times. But what about the meals that are connected with sacrifices made to God? This is something that a lot of people don't catch, apparently. But many of the sacrifices that Israel was told to make to the Lord involve them eating a portion of it. They are fellowshipping with the Lord when they come and they offer these offerings. They get a portion of it. The priests get a portion of it, and the Lord gets a portion of it. That's called the memorial portion, and it's burned in its entirety. But the priests get their part, and they eat it, and the worshiper gets their part, and they eat it too. Not with every sacrifice. The burnt offering and the sin offering and the guilt offering, those don't involve the worshiper getting a portion to eat. But with the grain offering, with the peace offering, with the vow offering and the free will offerings, those involve a portion being given to the priest and or the worshiper to eat and thus fellowship with the Lord in a meal situation. So God says, "You may not eat of what is meant for the Levites, and what is an offering, you must eat it in the place where the Lord chooses." Where is that place? It is where the tabernacle is. It's where the Ark of the Covenant is. That's where God's presence dwells for Israel to come in fellowship with him and worship him. And it is pointed out, everyone is to be involved. He says, don't you dare neglect the Levite that is within your walls. Why was it so important that they not neglect the Levite? Well, one, the Levites were specially ordained for service unto the Lord. That happened back in, Exodus chapter 32, maybe 33. But it is where Moses draws a line in the sand and says, "Hey, Israel has sinned in worshiping this golden calf. If you are on the Lord's side, come unto me, and if you are not, then you will, of course, undergo punishment." And only the Levites came over to stand on Moses' side. So that day, the Levites were consecrated for special services unto the Lord. And a part of that arrangement was that became their inheritance, not any, farmland. The Israelites received farmland in the land of Canaan as their inheritance from the Lord. And he said the Levites don't get farmland. They don't get land to cultivate. They instead rely on the generosity and the faithfulness of all the other Israelites. Now, generosity being, if they really just wanted to give a lot of stuff to the Levites, they could do that. But faithfulness in that every Israelite was required to calculate a tenth of everything they make and give it to the Levites that are within their walls. And so that is not just generosity, that is faithfulness to God, because it's a command from God. And so don't neglect the Levite Israelites, because they depend on your faithfulness and your generosity. It's a very important thing for the Israelites. God touches on it multiple times. Don't neglect the Levites, because this is a part of your obedience to God, he says to the Israelites. Then, to the end of chapter 12, he talks about a warning. He gives a warning against idolatry. He says, when the Lord your God, this is from verse 29, when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and you dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, that I may also do the same? You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. For every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fires to their gods. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do, You shall not add to it or take away from it. So, God gives this warning against idolatry. The long and short of it is that you shouldn't even be interested in how they worshipped their gods. Archaeology, I believe, is one matter, just really being curious about the practices of these ancient peoples, and that helps us understand the context of the Bible, because that is in an ancient context, right? It's good to understand the surrounding nations and their practices, so we understand why God tells them to do things and to not do other things, but to be curious about it with the intention of saying, I'm really considering worshiping these other gods. God says, do not even inquire about how these other gods serve, or how these other nations served their false gods. Do not even ask about it. The Lord hates the kind of things that they have been doing in service to their gods. One of those things being, like it mentioned, that they sacrificed their own children, their own sons and daughters, to their gods. God hates that kind of thing. He hates the things that they have been doing in service to their gods. Then, as we get into Deuteronomy 13, he gives the command to recognize false prophets. He says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them, you will not listen to his words, the words of that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and listen to his voice. And you shall serve him, and hold fast to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So here he says, recognize false prophets. What if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises and said, let's go serve those other gods? I just received a divine vision, and we need to serve the other gods. Don't even listen to him. He says, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. And then he goes on in the next section. This is from verses 6 through 18. We're going to run out of time if I read every verse, so I'll just summarize. He says, what if my close relative or my good friend or, even my spouse, right? What if they start serving other gods? Well, the Lord says, do not yield, do not listen, do not pity them, do not spare them, and don't conceal them. This is one of those passages that you're kind of like, whoa, he really told Israel to do that? Well, this is really important. He says, your hand shall be the first against them. God takes this matter extremely seriously, right? And if God took the matter extremely seriously in the context of the old law, how extremely seriously are we to take the matter now, to use the words that the Hebrew writer uses, now that we have the much better message, now that we have the much better way, the more superior one that was not delivered through angels, as he says in Hebrews, but it was instead delivered by God himself, the very Son of God. How much more so should we pay close attention and be very careful to follow the will and the commandments of God, now that we have this much more direct, much more serious, and much more effective way that has been taught to us. The Hebrew writer says, back then, they never did anything wrong and got away with it. You know, whenever someone disobeyed the laws of the covenant, they were duly punished for it. He says, why then would we ever think that we could get away with anything now? You know, the consequences might not come while you're on this earth, but that doesn't mean they'll never come. Because, as we know from the other places that the Bible teaches, there's more to this creation of God than just this earth, and this earth is going to pass away, and we look forward to new heavens, new earth, after the day of judgment. And the day of judgment is coming. And so, we need to take this very seriously, and part of that is we don't tolerate sin. We don't tolerate sin among our assemblies, lest our assemblies be made unholy because of our toleration for sin. And it goes on in verses 12 through 18, what if one of our cities are drawn away to serve those other gods? Well, he says, first you go and you inquire about these rumors. You go and you search diligently to see if it is true, because this is serious. We cannot rely on hearsay. We have to find out for ourselves if this is really happening. And he says, if it's not, then great. They're not committing the sin. That's great. But if it is true, then you must devote that city to destruction. All of the spoils are devoted to destruction too, because they have been tainted with this idolatry. Again, that's really serious. God takes it very seriously. And then in chapter 14, and this is actually almost the whole chapter. It's all the way up until verse 21. God talks about clean and unclean foods. He says, you are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not, this is actually different from clean and unclean foods, you shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your forehead for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So cutting oneself and also shaving oneself for the dead, that's a very interesting one, is a common pagan practice. And we know for a fact that to make incisions into yourself and also to shave your body, not just your head, on behalf of the dead was a common practice in Egypt. And of course, that's where Israel is coming out of. In the narrative of the Torah, they're coming out of Egypt, and of course, they're going to be influenced by the practices that were abundant there. So again, God is saying, don't engage in these pagan practices. So then he goes on to talk about clean and unclean foods. He says, you shall not eat, verse 3, of any abomination. These are the animals that you may not eat, or that you may eat, and he gives a list. And he says, these are the animals that you may not eat. And he gives lists involving all of the different domains of animals, that is, land animals, water animals, and I guess you could call them air animals, sky animals, the birds, the ones that fly in the air. And we've talked about these lists. They're almost exactly the same. We've talked about these lists before, and so I won't go over it again. But I will say, while there are a plethora of health-related reasons for these regulations, like people like to talk about that a lot, especially in the regards to eating swine and eating pork, and the fact that if it was not properly cooked, then you could very easily die in the ancient world. But while there is a plethora of health-related reasons for these regulations, the fact that they are listed immediately following all these other commandments warning against idolatry strongly implies that the reason why they're actually in the Bible is because they're related to paganism in one way or another. Okay, so eating, pigs, very much used in pagan practices. Just to give context of why pigs are so much talked about in that, but excuse me. Yeah. But also other animals that we don't really understand why they are excluded from the list of things that Israel can eat. But because they are in the context of these pagan practices and the forbidding of pagan practices, we get the idea, we get the gist of it, that they are related to pagan practices. And the whole idea is Israel is not supposed to engage in paganism, in this idolatry, and therefore they are to be as far removed from those practices as they could be. And one of these practices that we can actually pinpoint as a common Canaanite religious practice is the very last one at the very end of verse 21. He says, "You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." This is actually one that for a long time perplexed biblical scholars, including the Jews. They said, well, why in the world did God tell them not to boil this a young goat in its mother's milk? And what they came up with is the kosher law that says you cannot eat meat with dairy. Specifically, you cannot eat meat with dairy products made from the milk of that same kind of animal. And while that, I guess, kept them from disobeying this practice, it was also overshooting the actual command, the actual reason for the command, because we have found via recent archaeological finds that it was a common Canaanite religious practice to boil a young animal in the milk of its mother specifically, and therefore offer that to their fertility goddess, the Canaanite fertility goddess, whose name I actually I forget. I think it's Ashera, but that might not be true. Don't quote me on that. But the boiling the young goat is connected to the pagan practice of offering sacrifices to the fertility goddess. And the fact that for many years, and for even now, an entire group of people has this tradition about not being allowed to eat meat with dairy products, stems from a complete lack of understanding of what this particular commandment was trying to say. And so don't fall into that kind of trap, right? Because, like I said, while we do not follow the commandments of the law of Moses specifically because they have been brought to their end, we can use them to better understand the heart and mind of God. And a big part of that is understanding the context of these commands. There is a whole lot of stuff in the Bible that you will just completely misunderstand if you don't know the context. A big one that I have happened upon, the idea of people misunderstanding them a lot recently, is the parables of Jesus. You know, Jesus delivered his parables in a very particular context, and while they do have moral implications that apply to us, the first lens through which you should interpret them is the lens of what he is actually trying to say in context with that parable. And you can come and ask me about that later. I don't have time to talk about that right now. But even the foods commonly associated with idolatry it was forbidden for Israel to indulge in. So the gist of what I want us to get here is that God took idolatry very, very seriously. And he still does. If you look in Colossians chapter 3, I'm trying to turn to it now. Colossians is one of those books that I keep forgetting exactly where it is. I have to turn page by page to find it. But anyway, in Colossians chapter 3, Paul says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passions, evil desires, and covetousness," he says, "which is idolatry." I could do a whole lesson on just that list of things, but in short, it tells us that if we focus on these things, which are just things of the world, like how John talks about in 1 John chapter 2, then we are letting idolatry, the worship of things, dwell and fester and grow in our minds and in our hearts. And God hates when that happens. And if we let idolatry be written on in our minds and on our hearts, then the law of God cannot be. That's all I got for you tonight. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that everybody stays safe, stays healthy. You know, the pandemic, the virus is still out there. It's still being a problem. So stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you all, and have a good night.